Hey guys, I'm Amira and welcome to Open Up. This is your communication podcast and I am your host, also known as the communication expert. I'm your podcast host, your life coach, and also a speaker. Each and every single week, I'm going to be bringing you conversations to help you level up the way that you communicate, whether that's with yourself or in your relationships. Through each conversation, you're going to leave with food for thought, skills that you didn't know you needed, and ways to develop your relationships. So join me here as you learn the lessons that you didn't get to learn at school. Pull up a seat and join us as we open up. Today, I am joined by qualified psychotherapist Tasha Bailey. She is also an award-winning content creator and she's the author of Real Talk. Today, guys, we're taking you on a healing journey where you're going to understand the impact your childhood has had on the way you show up in your adult relationships. We look at your friendships, how you communicate at work, and we touch on your love life. Tasha's mission is all about making therapy bite-sized and accessible, as well as destigmatizing mental health. She not only brings a whole entire suitcase of analogies today, but words of wisdom and an energy and a sense of fun to make you feel so human. Today, guys, this episode was an absolute pleasure and joy, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Tasha, welcome to the Open Up podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's so good to reconnect, to see you again.
I love when you said as well before we started recording, like, yeah, but Amira, this is a different kind of episode because we have history. So I'm going to disclose because I feel like it's a good thing to disclose. We started at college together and then uni as well, no?
We at the same uni?
What uni did you go to?
Brunel.
Yes.
Did we?
Yeah, do you know why? Because I always remember college.
Yeah.
And at uni, I think I was really like quiet and hidden.
Yeah.
Did my books and went. I didn't really hang out.
Yeah.
And I can't remember why, but the memory's there.
And now that you say that, I think I remember. I feel like I remember we started uni at the same time, but I think we just never saw each other.
Yeah.
After that, yeah.
But I think I was that person that didn't see anybody.
Yeah.
That makes me sound so antisocial.
You were studying. You was like, focusing on the good things.
I'm not gonna lie. That is what I did for like 3 years of my degree. I think I went to the gym and I studied. That's my story.
I was not that person. I was like,
Were you not?
Partying. I was on campus all the time.
I'm just letting you know I needed a bit of you in my life. Like, what? I had it so wrong. And we're also going to get into this episode of why I had it so wrong today. I said to you as well, like, my core memory is so lovely when you said as well, just to reconnect. But my core memory is seeing you through our 20s, like mainly on Instagram, and just knowing you were studying and you were doing your day-to-day job. I have no recollection of what you were studying. Obviously, I know now. And to see you here and honestly, to see you thriving, I love to see it. But I'm also so excited to pick your brains today, to hear your expertise. And I love what I'm going to call your mission. I just really, really love it. And I'm here for it and I'm about it.
Oh, thank you. That's so lovely. That's so beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to get into the deep chat.
Okay.
And I love to look back at how we've grown up. I'm so intrigued by it. And also the way it impacts us as adults. Because sometimes my belief is that we spend so much of our adult life unpacking how we've grown up. So let's start with, what is it, or what are some of the things that you feel we need to understand about our childhood, about our family dynamic that impacts the way we communicate and show up in the world as adults?
Okay, the first thing is that a lot of people tend to dismiss their childhoods. They'll be like, yeah, that was ages ago, that doesn't impact me now. But actually, the first 7 years of our life are often the most impactful. It's when our brain changes the most. We learn the most things. We learn our language. We learn about relationships. Everything we learn comes from those first 7 years to begin with. And then obviously we get other experiences that might challenge those things. But those are the ones that are like not set in stone, but they're in like a really, like you got a pencil.
Yeah.
And you kind of like, what's the word? When you draw like really harshly.
I know exactly. And like you're going over it and going over it again.
That is those first 7 years. And it takes a lot of time to kind of unload, unpack, change some of those learnings that we get in those first 7 years. So childhood really does shape who we become. And we can undo some of those things, but it just takes a lot of work, a lot of learning, relearning again, making lots of mistakes. So things like attachments, how we meet people and date people in our relationships often comes from how our parents treated us and how they showed their love, as well as how they showed love to each other. So if you grew up with mum and dad in the household, how they had their relationship and how they showed love to each other is often how we will then kind of pass on our love in our adult relationships. So it's really important to kind of unpack and look at those things.
So many questions already, right? And I'm like, I want to ask you this, I want to ask you this. Let's start with the 0 to 7. Now, the only reason I know that is because my mum is a teacher. So when she was qualified, and she qualified when I think I was a teenager, but I remember her studying, like I wasn't young. So, and I remember her doing whatever dissertation she needed to do for her qualification, and that was part of it. And I think she did the nurture versus nature argument, and so I remember that from that stage. And I can definitely vouch for when you talk about you can shift it, but it takes a lot of work, and it's like a repetition of like relearning. I'm going to ask this question and I'll explain why later. Knowing that it takes a lot of work to relearn those early years, whether it's attachment, whether it's love, whether it's how we learn to communicate, our view on relationships, just to like name a few. As a therapist and someone that's qualified, why should we bother? Because the other side of it is you can equally keep your head in the sand or be none the wiser or not go below the surface and also still live your life equally unaware.
Yeah, but you also will have the same problems happening over and over again. Like when we learn things that are unhelpful to us, they will create a lot of problems for us in other ways. So for example, if we have an attachment style where our parents show us a lot of love and so we don't show a lot of love to other people, it means that we're not going to get the relationships that we want and need and that will fulfill us until we do the work of understanding why we are that way and what we can do to change it. So we will end up, living quite unfulfilled lives, whether that impacts our love, our work, how we feel about ourselves, our friendships. It won't be the best, basically.
So I just needed to hear it from the expert, and I'm already converted. And I really love that in terms of you explaining it's going to show up in your life, in a relationship, in some way, shape or form.
Yeah.
And you can kind of put it off for so long. And I remember, this is kind of like a side note, but I was running a workshop and it happened to be on imposter syndrome. And somebody came up to me at the end and said, Amira, like, what about if I just don't do anything about it? Like, is anything bad going to happen to me? And it's actually like the impact. I always say that as humans, what do we crave? We crave connection. Like our relationships with the people around us and with ourselves are pretty important.
Yeah. So
it's beautiful to hear it from the expert. Get it validated.
I was going to say, I in my book, I say, whatever you don't address becomes a mess. And it's almost like, we all have that cupboard or that room in the house that we put all the crap in.
Yeah.
All the things that we don't need, we don't want, we just put them in the basement, we put them in that storage cupboard, but eventually that storage cupboard is going to overflow and spill and cause a problem. And that's basically how it is if we don't unpack our own stuff. We will essentially, all the emotional difficult things that we face, we put them to the storage cupboard in our brains and our hearts, and they will overflow and overwhelm us and stress us out and come out in ways that we don't want it to come out. So it's better to take the time. And also, it's not just time, it's like it's giving yourself permission to feel the pain of it all as well, because it can be quite painful to look at those early years, to do that and to then unpack it, address it, because otherwise it will be a very messy future for us.
I adore that. Most definitely a mantra. I'm like, yes, guys, we need to take that away. And I love the permission to feel the pain, feel how hard it is. And goes back to the point when you said, Amira, so many of us can dismiss our childhood. And something else that I hear sometimes is clients will say, yeah, like I had an amazing upbringing. And I'm not here to dispute that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not here to challenge that. But sometimes there's other things that still, even though it was amazing, still might be missing that are impacting you now as an adult. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say when we think about our childhood, often we assume we're just talking about our parents.
Yeah.
But also there is the family. So, you know, whether you had an amazing family, there's still going to be family dynamics that were difficult. You know, if maybe someone passed away in the family, or if someone was absent, or if just the family culture didn't give permission to be vulnerable or to bring your emotions, that are all things that can be quite traumatic. But also outside of that, we have other parts of our lives as kids. We have school, we have friendships, we have teachers. These are all influential people who can impact how we feel about ourselves and the experiences that we have. And then even outside of that, we have culture. So, for example,
I was waiting for it. I was like, Tasha, please say it.
So, for example, you know, I am a Black British woman of Jamaican heritage, and there are things in that culture that are not good messages in terms of mental health and well-being. But also outside of that, you then have TV, film, advertising. You know, in the chapter in my book, I talk about body image and how, you know, there were adverts that said things like, I grew up in the 90s, so it's like adverts like, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. And when you're a chubby little kid, like, and you're hearing these things, and that is going to be also traumatic because it's making you doubt your own self and you doubt your own body. So these are all parts of, you know, your childhood upbringing and what can be difficult. Even if you had an amazing family, there are other ingredients in your childhood that might need to be looked at as well.
I just think we so needed to hear that. And it's a piece that took me ages to work with. And sometimes we'll get into this, right, in terms of like your family dynamic and actually how did you grow up and what are some of the components you can look at to understand. But for me, I know school played a really huge part in my life, and it was something that I kind of shut out, didn't really remember too much, and I don't want to spoil the rest of our episode, so we'll get into it and I'll like share examples. But I think I didn't realize the impact that a lot of my teachers had on me and how that played out into when I walked into a corporate world as well, with like the stories I'd tell myself, where they'd come from. And it isn't as well in terms of, and I'm sure you're going to add to this, okay? It isn't in terms of like, oh, I was blaming my teachers, but I just was blind to the impact of why I felt certain things. And now it's easy for me to pinpoint and remember most of my like school life, I was like second best in terms of how they viewed me, or I was smart, but I was loud. And I was smart or I was bossy. So like, you're actually not top of the class. Like, you're going to be the one underneath. And so it gave me that narrative of like underdog and constantly having to fight. And I like to think I am so much better at it, but it's still like, I can notice if it ever comes back in and be like, okay, wait, you know how to deal with this now. You can sit with it. And even when you shared about body image and the influence of the 90s, I always say, for me, it's so interesting because for some reason, I have like no recollection of like body image for me growing up. But I also think when I look at like my mum, it was something that I don't remember her ever talking about in a negative way. So I'm just going to put it down to thanks, mum. Like, it grounded me because we grew up in the same era, right? And I know that is something that's has influenced so many people in a negative way as well. I'm talking monologue here, okay? Because let's just talk about culture, please.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's do it. You said as well, you're like, I'm a Black female British woman, and there's certain things in culture that messages that I would have like subliminally taken on. And I'm just going to put it out there, and I'm a mixed race British female. And for me, definitely one of my narratives was don't talk about your feelings, which might sound ironic considering my whole business is called Open Up. And the podcast, but it was a don't open up because you won't be seen as strong. And as a female as well, I think I would overdo that. I mean, I definitely didn't talk about my feelings for most of my life. But then also I'd overdo like my masculine energy, and I'd always feel like I had to take the lead, and I always feel like I had to be super strong. So where can we kind of start, if anyone's resonating with us, where can we start when it comes to culture? Because it can feel heavy. It can feel really heavy.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to like write a list of all the messages that you received from culture. When I mean culture, I mean family, I mean your cultural background, your identity, the groups that you were part of, like all these parts of your life. you would have got some kind of messaging, whether it was, we don't do feelings here, we don't talk about feelings. In my family, it was like, mental health was not a thing. Like, we just don't talk about it. It is a thing because there was mental health in my family, but we just don't talk about it because there was a kind of shame around it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of thinking about, what are those messages? What did you then leave with as a child, thinking and believing about yourself? Me thinking, okay, my family, we don't talk about mental health. That means that when my mental health is rocky, I've just got to like pack it in that cupboard and not talk about it and just pretend everything is fine and just, be the perfect, happy, smiley person and just, not actually address that there's other stuff bubbling underneath.
Yeah.
So it's kind of looking at, what are those kind of hidden messages that you've been carrying along with you, and how do they then limit you as a person? Because we are, to give your example, we are strong, we are fierce, we are confident and happy, but we also have other sides of us like vulnerability and softness, and actually we need those bits to get to the other bits like joy and happiness. And we have to remember that we are kind of eclectic and multifaceted, and we have so many different sides, and to shut off some of those sides for culture or for other people in our lives is actually going to do a hindrance to ourselves. And again, we won't live our most fulfilling, best lives as well as a result of it.
I adore this. Adore the cupboard analogy as well. I feel like we're going to leave this episode with like analogies, tools. This is my favorite kind of episode ever. And I love the examples you've given as well from both of us, but actually understanding the multifaceted. And I talk about it in terms of duality, like both things can be true, and how we create space for that. And I think I talk about labels as well a lot when it's like part of your identity. And I know as well that it was either, oh, you're the smart one, or yeah, but you're also a tomboy. And then it's like not fitting into other people's version of you. So I love as well when we're looking at it as a whole, and you're like, okay, but once you look at your family dynamic and culture, if it's relevant, then look wider as well. And I think as an adult, one thing I've like, this is probably my piece I'm still working with, is my friendships. That's probably one of my like things I'm getting to now, and I'm like, ooh, we've got work to do.
Friendships are hard though, because I feel like I could have written a whole book on friendships. I've still got so much thought around it, but I think we kind of lean into our friendships, or start to, when we're about 7, 8, 9, and it's like our friends are like an extension of our family. So whatever we don't get from our family, we get from our friendships. That's kind of how I see it. So I kind of say in my book, for example, that maybe I couldn't get, emotionally deep, vulnerable conversations with my family, but I attracted and found people in my life external to my family who I could do that with, aka my friends or sisters, as I call them. So our friendships can be so powerful in that sense. However, because they are so family-like, we can find ourselves kind of in set roles with our friendships, especially if we haven't healed family stuff. We will then reenact all that stuff with our friends. So if we're a people pleaser at home, we'll be a people pleaser with our friends. If we have no boundaries at home, we'll be having no boundaries with our friends. We'll be letting out all our money and always there for them, but then when they're not there for us, we don't speak up. So I think it's like it can be really hard work with friendships, because especially when we're on a healing journey, we need that support. But then we might be too scared to ask for that support, because it might create a shift in the friendship that we don't want to create. I don't know if that makes sense, but we don't want to rock the boat, essentially.
That makes so much sense. And also, I love as well in terms of you looking at it. I feel like this is next book coming, Tasha. Okay? I love you looking at it as, and explaining it to us as well, as the extension of your behavior in terms of what you're already doing at home, you're going to emulate or replicate. Feel free to change my words in your friendships. And then if you don't speak up at home, you're not going to speak up then when something's upsetting you or bothering you. But then also craving or trying to nurture the things that you might not be getting at home. And I think I remember one of my really poignant lessons in my 20s was feeling like one of my closest friendships was shifting and probably falling away. And the closest thing I could have described it to at the time was a breakup, was a romantic, and it was like, wow, this is literally hitting as deep as I would describe a breakup. And it was like the hardest thing in terms of, I don't think we've massively talked about it enough, and actually the part that it plays in our healing as well. So a question I honestly feel like I could go to so many different places with you right now. But I guess taking it back as well, when you talk about being on this healing journey and the place that friendships play in that, and hard to kind of communicate, or can be, when you're going through that. What about when you start to do the work for you as an individual and you're like committed, okay, to this healing journey? And even something you said earlier when you said it can be hard because it's easier to go and put it into the cupboard. And I know for me, one of my hardest things was being honest with myself. Like that has literally been one of the hardest things, like be able to own it and to not blame, not be like, it's because of, this is me, this is how I processed information, and I have to open that cupboard to be like, oh, okay. And I always say with love and with compassion and gently and with someone else supporting you. But let's talk about, it's one of the most asked questions I get. You're doing the work, you're on this healing journey, wherever you are on this journey, but the people around you aren't. What happens?
Oh boy. So
I know that was a big question, so break it down in whatever way you want.
Oh dude, there's bad news and good news. The bad news is that if you're on that healing journey and other people are not, it is likely impossible that you are going to lose some of those relationships.
I think we need to hear that though. We need to hear that.
Yeah, because you're growing and they're not growing on the same journey as you. And, you know, some friendships, for example, might be holding you back. So, for example, if you have a difficult relationship with alcohol and you're like, I need to really change things up here because it's not good for me, it doesn't feel good. But then all your friends are still onto that culture of drinking every time you meet up. How are you going to grow through that difficult situation? It's like another analogy here. It's like growing a plant in the wrong soil. That soil is not good for you. That environment is not good for you. So actually you might have to make some changes, be in a different place, maybe even be by yourself for a while before you make new connections. So yeah, that is the bad news, is that you can't carry people on that healing journey with you unless they're gonna do the work themselves. The good news is some people, not all, but some people, or no, I hope so, that some people are really going to be encouraging your healing journey, and actually seeing you heal might inspire them to look into themselves as well. And you're going to attract more people who are on the same journey, who are looking after themselves, who are soft and vulnerable and open up themselves too. So you're going to attract whatever you're working on, you're going to attract into your life as well.
I honestly think you giving us both the good and the bad news goes back to your point around being multifaceted, creating space for both, and actually learning how, as some of those relationships, whether family or friendships, change, that it's okay and it's feeling that pain, going through a process, but also the good part that as some kind of, I say, peel away or shed away, you're also going to attract relationships more in alignment. And I love the way you described it, that you didn't say like on the same level, because sometimes I feel like with that narrative, it's like you're putting other people down because you decided to be on this healing journey. And I'm a really, really big believer that everyone comes to it when it's their time to come to it.
Yeah, you can't, drag them along with you. You can't force them to see your therapist as well, or to read the books. Like they need to go in their own journey, and you can be patient with that. But also, if that means that's hurting you in the process, and also step away. The other thing I was just thinking of was about friendships, and it is really hard because I think, and what I often see is that we gain a lot of friendships in our teens and in our 20s, and then they start to drop off. And that's a natural process because our values change, our priorities change. And one thing that a friend said to me was like, it's like, so she said, it's like going on an airplane on a long distance flight, you can only carry 23 kilograms. And so you have to be really particular and thoughtful and reflective about what you're bringing with you and who you're bringing with you. You can't carry all of your life belongings with you on a flight. It's not going to work. It's not going to be purposeful. It's not going to be important. It's not going to really be nurturing for you. So actually you have to kind of think about who is actually weighing me down. And even though that might be a difficult decision to make, it's going to be best for the future you. So yeah, and where you want to go.
adore, also made it feel like so realistic though as well, in terms of, and I think as well, sometimes you tell me from your experience, we're not taught enough like how to let go. And I know as well, like, one of my really good qualities is I'm loyal, but throughout my early 20s it was really detrimental, because I honestly truly felt like every relationship I had was like forever. And that process of having to let go, I learned it by going through it. That was really how I managed to navigate it. And even now, it doesn't mean that I'm like a pro at it and I'm always like, oh, need to create space for something new. But I just learned how to grieve for whatever that is that I need to let go of or say goodbye. And I love the analogy of the 23 kilograms. So you've got to choose, and also as well understand like what aligns with your values or your priorities in that chapter of your life. And life changes and you have different responsibilities. My friend always used to, different analogy, but it reminds me as you were talking, it's like you're all ships and you pass each other and you all have your cargo. And this is a slightly different, because it was talking about when you're taking on too much from other people. And it's like, if you are, you need to throw your cargo overboard. Like, we're not doing this. So I really, really like that. And I think that there's something powerful in learning how to let go and find the peace with that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we as a culture are very grief avoidant. So, when we think about, again, 90s, when I think about a lot of films like Bridget Jones's Diary, it's like when she's alone, it's like, oh my God, end of the world. This is the worst thing ever. Everyone's like, when are you going to get a mat? Like, there's a real kind of sense of, we don't like to be alone and we're afraid of our own company.
Yeah.
And so that means that we can often hoard a lot of friendships that we don't actually need. They're not serving us any purpose. So yeah, I think it's about finding that capacity to be alone and to enjoy your own company, and to know that, have that hope that I will find people in my tribe that are going to be better suited to me, rather than to hold on to people for the wrong reasons.
That is so powerful. I feel like, as well as we like go live with this episode and like month of love, but also like self-love and understanding yourself. And I think it's okay if you haven't been alone before, or you haven't let go, for it to feel super scary, or like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this time. And I'm a really big believer of, I mean, I also love my own company, but just if you're going through that transitional phase in life, understanding what it is to be on your own and how to at least start to like it and sit with it. And I always say as well, before I met my partner, I actually like gave myself a detox, and it was like super intentional. But I got to the point where I really realized I was entertaining things and energy that wasn't serving me. And I was like, right, I'm going to be very, very intentional. And then I created space, and I got to a point where I was like, oh my God, I really like my routine. And these are the things I'm like learning about myself. And I say it in a way as well where it doesn't mean that when you're with somebody that it's not possible, but just knowing, is there a part of your life where you've learned to be on your own? I think that's quite important.
Yeah. It's kind of like looking for a meal when you're like really, really hungry. You're going to look for the wrong things. You're going to go for like the McDonald's and the quick wins, rather than something that's going to be actually nurturing and nutritious and good for you. So it's like, yeah, finding that way of like stepping back, satisfying your own hunger and your own time, like doing that piece first, and then look for what you need as well.
I'm so here for these analogies because it just resonates, and I feel it makes the point practical. And sometimes when you're in that moment and it feels so hard and so difficult, and you're trying to do something differently, beautiful, grounds us. Thank you. So let's take it a little bit back to that family dynamic, or even like the family structure of how we grow up. And everybody's family unit looks really different. I was gonna say, let's start with like parental relationships, because that feels like a good place to start. Let's go with the narrative that somebody says, I've had an amazing childhood, and we're not disputing that. But what other things might be missing in some of their relationships with their parents, even if they've had an amazing childhood?
Yeah. I think it's really good to think about presence from a parent or both parents.
Okay.
And there's two types of presence. There's physical presence. So how much were they there physically? Were they in the family home? Were they attending your parents' evenings, your extracurricular activities? Did they have like, did you get to go have day outs with them? Like that is that physical presence, and also things like physical affection and hugs and all of that stuff. Like, do you feel that you had that, and what things maybe felt like they were missing?
Okay.
And then you've also got emotional presence. So how much, when you were crying, how did they respond to you? Did they say, oh, I'm so sorry this is happening, what can I do to help? Or did they say, you're being dramatic, stop crying, go to your room, play with your toys, So thinking about those two types of presence, physically and emotionally, how were they there for you?
You make things so simple for us and just give us a starting point and so much clarity. So
actually, can I add something as well?
Of course. Of course.
I was just thinking that basically, like, you could have a parent that is both physically and emotionally present for you.
Okay.
But maybe there were times when they couldn't. So maybe they were going through an illness, or maybe they were going through a bereavement, or maybe they had to go away for work or something. And if it was just like a small period of time, that would have had some kind of impact on you as a kid, because you're a kid and you don't understand the context of what's happening.
Yeah.
So it might be that it's a long period, or that's just how they are, or it might be that it was just a short period of change that happened and it disrupted your personal, presence and your own personal kind of how safe you felt as a child.
I adore this because there's just so much context into everything we're saying, and it's not, oh, it might be this or it might be that, but just understanding the context of how you viewed the world as a child. I love when you said as well, ingredients, all the different ingredients that could have impacted the way that you see yourself, like your beliefs, how there are some things that we believe that limit us, and how you're going to retrain that and do that differently.
Mm-hmm.
If we aren't quite aware then of whether it's parents, I don't know as well, you might want to split this out, but parents or your caregivers, whoever you kind of brought you up, and we're not aware maybe of where they weren't there emotionally, how's that going to impact on an adult level, as we're an adult and they're an adult, and the way that we communicate and the way that that relationship shows up?
Okay, so first it's going to show up in how we communicate with ourselves. So like that example that I gave of a parent saying to a kid, oh, you're being dramatic, get over it, go play with your toys, it's fine, you don't need to cry about it. We're going to say it to ourselves. We're going to say, oh, I'm being dramatic, this is like, I shouldn't take this so seriously, let me just put a smile on, pretend that it's fine. That's how we're going to talk to ourselves. We're going to not allow ourselves to be vulnerable and to hold our own emotions. Instead, we'll just dismiss them, put them in the cupboard, try to forget about them. But you can't forget about your feelings because they will be there waiting for you. So yeah, it'll be kind of how we speak to ourselves. And then it'll be how we speak to others, how we communicate to others. So if we have a partner that's then feeling emotional, we're going to be like, oh, you're being dramatic, get over it, man up, or whatever it is, like be strong, be fierce, whatever it is. We're going to kind of communicate that same way, expect the things that our parents expected us to be, we expect from ourselves and for other people as well.
It makes so much sense when you explain it like that. How can we start to be aware and start to change some of those patterns?
Boy.
I thought I'd give you all the big questions today.
We have to have awareness. Is that the first thing? It's like allowing ourselves moments to pause and to reflect on our own behavior, which can be very uncomfortable. But allowing that we need awareness before we can make any changes. So you don't even have to make any big changes in that moment, but just being like, I noticed that I just called myself dramatic just then. That's interesting. Okay, cool. And doing that more and more and more. And eventually over time, you'll start to stop yourself in the moment before or say something different to yourself in that moment. So that can be really helpful. Having, a coach or a therapist who can make you accountable and who can like hold a mirror up and say, oh, you're doing that thing again. You're being hard on yourself rather than holding yourself and your emotions. Rather than being soft, you're being harsh and critical of yourself. So having that person who can hold the mirror up. Journaling can be great because again, you're literally having a conversation with yourself on paper, and you can then see in black and white what it is that you're saying to yourself and the expectations that you have. And then also books, like I've written a book that is kind of giving you some of those lessons and reflections so that you can do some of that work of unpacking. Because, yeah, it can be difficult and it can be hard to not know where to start or where to go first. So
one of the things that I love about your book, and I know I've said this to you already, but is because it's so bite-sized, and there's chapters that if you want to just explore one part of your life, you can literally delve into that chapter. I love the practical side within the book as well, and also your real talk snippets. So it also feels like when I'm reading the book, I'm speaking to you. And I'm like, oh, this is great. So I love that, because sometimes I think that if you've been stuffing things into the cupboard and it's starting to overflow, it can also feel really confronting to be like, do I really want to open this? So I think just even in that answer, 4 things that you can, if you just start one, just start with one. And I know I probably bang on about this all the time, but yeah, it's awareness. You can't change anything without actually an awareness and sitting with the uncomfortable feelings, which is really hard if you're not used to that as well.
Exactly. And I think the more that you sit with the uncomfortable, the less uncomfortable it becomes. You become more acceptance of, there are uncomfortable things that I'm going to feel throughout my life.
Yeah.
And I can't avoid that. And actually, the more I avoid it, the more uncomfortable it's going to be for me anyway. So let me just sit with it. Let me be with it. Let me just see what it has to say, and then we'll see what happens.
So I'm going to ask you a really practical question on that. And okay, let me ask a question. I was going to over-explain it. I was like, it doesn't need over-explaining. Sit with your emotions. Sit with it. Sit with the uncomfortableness. Can you make that practical for us?
Okay, yeah. So in my book, I talk about this poem called The Guest House by Rumi. And it basically describes your feelings as people. So imagine you have a house, and one morning there's a knock on the door, you open the door and sadness is standing there. And you would invite sadness in, maybe make them a cup of tea, see what they've got to say. And then when they're ready to leave, you say, all right, it's time to go now. And just, almost sitting with it like that, allow it, welcoming those feelings in, like, hi, okay, you're here, cool.
Yeah.
I wasn't expected to see anger today, but okay, it's here. And even like, I always say to like clients, almost imagine what that feeling would look like as a person. Would it have red hair? Would it have dark hair? Like, how would you describe it? And what does it need to say to you? What does it need to express and explore before it's ready to move forward and go on its way? Like, what does it need to say to you first? And just allow it to sit that way. And you might want to write that down. You might want to play a song for the emotion, whatever it is, but allow yourself to connect with it in that way, as you would if a friend came over or a guest.
Beautiful. I love the way as well you've used music as an example. And I think I love like the nuance of people, because I think everyone's individual, and I love like not just having one answer or one way of doing things. And in that, you've given us like this beautiful, I'm going to say like visualization or like visual to go with actually like what we can do in that moment. And also for me, it reminded me of like having that internal conversation with that feeling or with that emotion as though it's a person, and remembering. And I think sometimes that makes it a little bit easier to remember that whilst it might feel all consuming in that moment, you can kind of separate yourself from it.
Yeah.
And then goes back to what you said in terms of it's part of being a human. It's part of our experience that it's going to go up and down. You're going to feel high sometimes. You're going to feel anger sometimes. But being able, I don't know if tolerate's the right word.
No, I think it's like to be with, because tolerate is almost like, oh, I have to be with this thing, but
putting
it's
up
more,
with it.
Yeah, it's more like to be with, to allow, to connect with. And also with feelings, I think as kids we learn, happy, sad, angry or something, but there are like 70 different feeling words that happy, there's like glee, there's elated, there's proud, that there's so many different words that we don't use. And sometimes as well, we can feel different things at the same time. We can feel happy and sad at the same time, or anger and confusion and happy, or what, we could feel a mixture. So allow all those to have a space, not just one feeling.
I adore this, and I definitely think like a lot of our theme in terms of the multifaceted and the nuance and having like the space for both. I always use the example, like when I launched the business, I obviously was super excited. And the same day I got made redundant from my corporate job, and I didn't know it was coming. And I always feel like that's how I describe like both emotions. I was so incredibly excited and nervous, and oh my God, we've launched and it's live and we've put this out there to the world. And on the other side, I was like in tears. And it wasn't necessarily because it was, you know, the worst thing. It actually happened for a reason. But at the time, it was shock. It was what? It was realization of I'm losing what I viewed as stability. What do I do next? So much of the unknown. So I think it's probably one of my most like poignant memories of like a flood of such contradiction emotions in one very like big turning point in my life. Definitely. So one thing I'm also really intrigued to explore is sibling dynamics and your sibling relationships, and actually how that can kind of play out both in your childhood and your adulthood, because I think they have such an important part of like your ecosystem, and understanding that not everybody has good relationships with their siblings. But also, I don't know if I can call it this, but like the order of your siblings in terms of like how you were born, in what order, who's the oldest, who's the middle child, who's the youngest, if there's 3 of you, as an example. So where do we start with our sibling relationships?
Oh, okay.
We did friendships, we did parental. I was like, I can't not ask about siblings.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember if do I talk about sibling order in my book?
I don't think so, but I always call it sibling order. So I was like, I'm going to ask the expert in case I'm very wrong on this.
Do you know what it is? It's because it's one of the things that I wrote about, but then I had to edit quite a few things out. So I think that's one of the things I actually edited out. So this is interesting you asked me this.
Okay, then we can put this in the episode. I'm like, this is the edits that didn't make the book. They're here.
So sibling order can, it can like have a big impact on who we become. So for example, people say that the only child, for example, you're only really around adults. You're not around any peers or kids your age, unless maybe you have cousins that are around you a lot. And so it means that maybe you might be less playful sometimes, or you might speak with kids that age. With kids that are only child, they might tend to be more adultified, for example. And then, so there's like different like order things. But I also believe that there's like different roles we can have in the family. So, for example, you might have one person in the family who is the comedian or the mascot, and they're just like really cute, really funny. Their role is whenever there's any family tension, they lighten the mood and they divert the attention to something more fun and free. But then you'll also have people who are like the golden child, who are kind of perfect at everything, or maybe they have a particular talent or are very smart, and so they're kind of the poster child for the family. And kind of I think in that case it's like this kid in the family is like our pride and joy, and everyone should be like this kid because they're just amazing, like, and the other siblings might find themselves being compared to, why can't you be more like the golden child? Why can't you be more smart as the older child? Why aren't you doing your homework like the other child is doing? So there can be that comparison. So there's these different kind of roles that we can find in those families, and sometimes we can have more than one role as well. So you could be the golden child, but then when you start to slip up, you might turn into the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is the one who is, always told off, always in trouble, carries a lot of shame, lots of guilt. Whenever something bad happens, they're the one that is often blamed. So we can move roles and change roles in our family as well.
Oh, so complex. So understanding then that we might have more than one role as a sibling, as an only child as well, how can it show up for us in unhelpful ways as we move through to adulthood, whether it's work, whether it's love, in whatever relationship or area of life? Where is it going to start showing up in an unhelpful way?
So first, even though we're an adult, anytime we're with our family, we might get pulled back into those roles, whether it's done to us or whether we just feel it. You might go to Christmas dinner and you're already feeling like, they're gonna what am I going to get blamed for today? Because you've had that scapegoat history.
Yeah.
So that's one way that it will show up. But then it will show up probably at work, for example. So if you're the golden child in the family, then you are going to want to be or feel safer to be the golden child at work, which means you might overdo things. You might try to be a perfectionist. You might overwork yourself and burn out because it feels comfortable to be the golden child. And when you're not the golden child, you feel less than for whatever reason. So it can show up in work, it can show up in your relationships. It would just spill. It would just spill to everywhere.
You're like, guys, you're going to notice.
Yeah.
I think that was a really powerful example. Very obvious reasons why I'm picking up on this one. In terms of like work and then fitting into golden child, and then but also the comfortability with you sitting in that space. And I always call it like the labels we collect. And tell me if this is wrong, but I always look at it in terms of that's the familiar space. So then you either like revert back to it, or it shows up again as an example in work because that's what you know.
Yeah.
And you haven't yet retrained to learn a different way of showing up.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Absolutely. And also I think it might be a familiar space, but doesn't mean that it's a comfortable or good or healthy space.
Yes.
And that's where it kind of goes back to how, powerful childhood can be, because it almost creates these roles or creates these lessons that we have that we carry with us because they're familiar, but they're not always true. They're not always healthy, and they're not always nurturing. So like I said, being comfortable at being the overworker, that's not good for you. That's not good for anybody, because you're going to burn out and you're going to get tired, and then you're going to also think that the only thing that you can give to yourself or to others is your productivity. So yeah.
I'm going to ask a question on that because my beautiful, beautiful community are high achievers. So I can imagine that sometimes some of them overwork and perhaps are used to it as well. So if anybody is listening and they can resonate with this point specifically, how can they start to get themselves out of this loop or this pattern of overworking? Like, let's say they're walking away from this episode and they've got a better understanding of why. And they're starting to look at their family dynamic or the other influences in their life and can understand, oh gosh, yeah, this is actually showing up in whether it's work or another area. What can they do to counter it or change it or do it differently?
The main thing is boundaries.
We love boundaries.
We love boundaries. But I would say specifically boundaries with yourself.
Okay.
So for example, with works, or okay, I won't assume, but work, there's only so much that work is going to be saying to you, you need to do this and this. A lot of the time we are saying it to ourselves. So I think there's something about setting a boundary for yourself. So what is enough for me? I'm going to work on Monday. What is enough work for me before me burning out or before me not even losing enjoyment in this job? What would be enough? What is the bar? What is, within my capacity? And knowing that each day that bar will change. There's some days when you might be more tired or the work is less motivating, or maybe you've already given enough and actually let me just pull back a little bit and give myself a bit of grace. And, so really kind of thinking about what is my boundary with myself for work? What would feel okay for me to achieve? And also why, when you put that bar there, maybe question it as well, because you might put you might put 20 things on your to-do list, and actually who can do 20 things on the to-do list in a day? Probably no one, unless it's like something very, very small. But, try to look at the list that you've written and actually be a bit more realistic of what your capacity is.
I just took a moment to pause as I was listening, especially because when you're putting those boundaries in and you're saying, okay, question it, but where you said it's okay to pull back and it's okay to have grace. And sometimes I think, when you're in the loop of overworking, because it's so familiar, pulling back not only feels unfamiliar, but it's as though you feel or you believe that's still not enough. And I like to say that even when you're pulling back as an overachiever or where you've been overgiving, you're still probably going to be over the 100% mark.
Yeah.
So like you can pull back and still know that you're still overgiving because you probably still haven't pulled back enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I love this.
Yeah.
Okay, so you shared with me before we actually hit record that from the age of 15,
Yeah.
you knew you wanted to be a therapist.
Yeah.
Tell me why.
Okay, so there's a few different reasons. Where do I start? So the first thing is I kind of said it a little bit earlier, is that I grew up seeing mental health in my family, quite extreme mental health. So I always had that awareness that mental health was a thing, even though we didn't talk about it. And I think that as a kid, that made me very curious about what mental health is and what people are, and like just understand the motive behind people. I think I always had that curiosity. And then when I was a kid, probably like, I don't know, 8 or something, there's a film on Nickelodeon called Harriet the Spy. I don't know if you know or if you watched it.
Is it an animation?
It's
No.
It's a film. I can't remember the actress's name. But yeah, it's a film, and it's about a girl called Harriet who's like 10, and she goes around town pretending she's a spy, and she grows up with like a nanny, like a live-in nanny.
Okay.
But when she turns 10, the nanny goes to another job and leaves, and that's a big, huge grief for her.
Okay.
So her parents send her to see a child psychotherapist, and that was my first awareness of that job. And I was like, oh, that was really cool. Like, you just like help kids talk about their feelings with toys and games and stuff. And that was my first thing of like, oh, that would be a cool, I think I rewatched it when I was 15. I was like, oh, that'd be a cool job for me to do. Like, I'd love to do that. So it kind of came from there. And then obviously after uni, I did my training as a child psychotherapist, loved working with children, didn't expect to want to work with adults, but then actually I started to, and I loved that work as well, because I realized that we all have a childhood, and we all have an inner child who probably needs a bit of love and tenderness and a space to feel and be validated. So that's kind of how the journey got here.
It makes so much sense when you share it and when you tell it. And I love the power of like influence, and when you see something or you watch it or you hear it exactly when you need to, and why it can hit home at that moment. Now, touching on inner child, because I know that we've not gone into that space today, but where you said giving your inner child that little bit of love, that nurturing. Why is it important to sometimes take ourselves back to our inner child and think about what that inner child needed?
So I always say no one had a perfect childhood. It's not possible. There are no perfect people in this world. Our parents do their best, but they're not perfect. And so things would naturally be left out. And so there are going to be some wounds, some pains that we didn't have resolved. So as adults, and especially if we're finding ourselves stuck in certain patterns that are unhealthy, that don't feel good, or life doesn't feel good, we probably need to look back to see what's missing. You know, there's an ingredient that we didn't get to have access to, and we can give it to ourselves now in a healing way. So whether that is, I don't know, being more emotionally present to ourselves because our parents were able to be emotionally present for us, or finding friendships that are more physically present because, again, we didn't get to have that as a kid. So just finding ways to almost mend those wounds, whether it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, is always going to be really powerful. And I always say you can do that. There's 2 ways that you should do that.
Okay.
The first way is doing the inner child work. So what we've been talking about, like going back, thinking about what was missing, thinking about, you know, the pains that you're left with, feeling those things so that you can process them. And then the other thing is inner child play. So that is kind of connecting with little you, whether that's through like creativity, play, fun activities, just things that kind of bring you back to your younger self, can be really, really healing, and also kind of makes you feel safe as well.
I'm smiling because we weren't ever going to like really go there. And I just love when a conversation flows and you just end up in a different space. One of my focuses for this year is the inner child play and finding the joy again. And I joke because I am quite a serious person. And there's reasons why. I have to sometimes remind myself, like, all right, you're human, you can like have fun. But reconnecting with my inner child. And I know something, I talk about this on Instagram as well, but like, I love going for a bike ride. It's like and just riding around Hyde Park is one of my favorite, most basic things to do. That and colouring in are like my two things that I love and adore, and I'm so present. But for me, it's like my inner child play. And actually this year as well, for me, my word is like fun and joy, and in the everyday as well, because sometimes I get so serious and I am an achiever, so it's like the next thing, and actually I'm missing things, but it goes back to that for me. So I love that you shared that, but two beautiful ways in terms of, okay, we've got the side we've been talking about, but okay, let's have that play and that fun and maybe experiment with it as well.
Yeah. And also, like, it can be quite healing. So, for example, some of my inner child stuff is things that I was scared of as a child. I've revisited as an adult and had a different experience.
Oh, lovely.
Or, like, for example, like in the body image chapter, I'll talk about I used to dance as a kid and I loved dance, but then the environment, the teachers that I had made me feel very conscious about my body. So as an adult, I now go to dance classes where my body is affirmed and feels like, you know, accepted and belonging and stuff like that. So that's very healing for me and my inner child, because she's not being told, oh, your body's not good enough. She's being told, oh, your body can exist here. So it can be really healing in that way as well.
I was like, oh, that got me emotional. I was like, it doesn't take a lot for me, okay? Like, I literally feel it to my core. That is so incredible, so powerful, and so beautiful. Side note, I was like, please, can I come to class with you? But as you were talking, I think one of my things is, there's a couple things. It's probably for me languages and music. And so I learnt piano when I was growing up, and trombone, but trombone was my first instrument, and piano I always felt like I just wasn't good enough at it, and languages as well. And so you had your influences by the time you got to 15 and knew what more or less you wanted to do or why you were interested in it, and one thing's led to another. And I feel I've always had like this affiliation to Spain, and I can't tell you why, and I don't really know where it comes from. So I've always like loved the language, but there's a really distinct memory of where I wanted to study it for A level, and I'd only studied it for a year for my GCSE. And I'd gone to like this open day, and they turned around and been like, yeah, no, it was so brutal. I can't actually remember it word for word, but it was like, no, you're just not good enough to study it. Whereas somebody else had said, yeah, there's going to be work to do, but like we can work on that together. So one of my things, I haven't done it yet, but I'm most definitely in my adulthood going to learn Spanish and be able to speak fluently, even if it's broken and even if like it's not the best, but it brings me so much joy. It reminds me when you're sharing what dance means to you and then showing up in a space where you are affirmed.
Yeah,
I could talk to you all day, and I'm like, Amira, end the episode, end the episode. Okay, before I pour my heart out to you and say thank you, every single guest, I ask 3 questions. I think it's a beautiful way to wrap up our episode. Also, sometimes there's things that you want to share that you might not have. So the floor is yours.
Okay.
Question number 1, no pressure. Okay. You just be you and show up as you. Question number 1 is, can you share either your favorite quote or some food for thought that you really want our listeners to walk away with and marinate in their minds?
Okay. So my food for thought is old doors won't open new ways. So doing the same things over and over are not going to get you different results, or being in the same patterns over and over are not going to get you different results. And sometimes it's about looking inwards actually to parts that you didn't want to address in order to find a new solution or a new route.
I just cannot ad-lib at this point, and I always have to force myself to be quiet. That was gold. That's all I'm going to say. I'm like, oh, Mira, interview her. Just keep it together. Gold, okay? Thank you.
It's okay.
Okay, a practical takeaway. I know we have filled this episode with incredible analogies. One that you want to share today.
A practical analogy is... No, not practical analogy. A practical point for me is how important safety is. So when you're doing this work of whether it's inner child stuff or, you know, healing from a breakup or something that you want to confront that feels difficult, always think about what's going to make me feel safe enough to do this work. Is it going to be me journaling, but I'm going to be in a corner in my living room with some blankets, some candles, some nice music, like whatever it is, it's going to create a positive impact on my body and my nervous system to feel safe enough to do this? Or is it going to be that I do it in a park or with friends or with a therapist? So always, with every situation, always think, what's going to make me feel safe enough to do this?
I love that. And also something that I feel like we've not touched on and adds such a beautiful reflection point. Amira, stop talking. Okay, and last but not least, and please self-plug because it so deserves it. I ask every guest some sort of resource, book, podcast, TV show that's helped you on your healing journey. And then please can we also just talk about the book because I'm like biggest fan.
Okay. Oh, okay. What do I... That's helped with my healing journey. Oh, so there is a show on BBC called Couples Therapy.
I love her so much. We watch it as a couple. I'm gonna be quiet, but I'm obsessed with it.
I love it. So it's like a real life, well, as you know, it's a real life therapist with real life clients, couples, and there's like different couples, there's like different ethnicities, different sexualities, different orientations, but it's so helpful because not only do you learn, I watch it with my husband as well, like not only do you learn as a couple, and we often watch it and then pause and then we'll talk about stuff and then continue watching, but also you learn about yourself as well, because as you see these couples in therapy, they're going through a journey as a couple, but they're also going on a journey as individuals and working out things about themselves. So I found it really, really helpful, not only as a therapist, I'm thinking, oh my God, how do I be a bit more like her? But also...
she's like, so good.
She's so amazing. But also just as a human in healing, which we all are, you know, learning, okay, this person's going through that. I wonder what that's like for me in my life and in my story. So I just find it so helpful. And then also, obviously, my book.
Hell yes, please.
my
Can
book,
we have the download? Yeah,
so my book is actually the book that I wish I had read when I was starting my healing journey and going through my healing journey, which I am of course still on because healing is forever. And it's basically real talk, lessons from therapy on healing and self-love. And it's essentially, I love therapy as a resource, but not everybody can afford it or access it or get the therapist that they need. And so I wanted to give a book as a gift, which is full of a lot of the things you would learn in therapy, a lot of the reflections that you might be asked to think about in therapy and unpack. And it includes things like childhood that we talked about, boundaries, sex, body image, can't think what else. Love and relationships, attachment. It's kind of very practical, but also very soft and vulnerable and open. Real talk.
I want to say thank you for writing the book, sharing the gift with us, and shining your light because we need you.
Oh, thank you.
You have been incredible. So blessed to have you here.
Oh, I'm so happy we got to do this.
Me too. Guys, thanks for joining us for another conversation this week. You know the deal by now, so please hit subscribe, leave a review. Don't forget to share this with a friend. And if you want to come and hang out with me, then click Instagram. You'll find me at _communication expert.